I want to give you a kind of a set of moral principles as a kind of philosophical background to looking at immigration. And this isn't actually something I came up with myself. About a dozen years ago, I attended a small private conference at Notre Dame. It was about 15 largely natural law scholars who examined the question of immigration. And I think it was one of the best conferences I've been into in my life. And so I sat down at the end of the conference and kind of did a summary of the conference, and now I'm passing it on to you. And I hope it will provide a kind of a general framework, a kind of moral framework for thinking about immigration. One thing you'll notice is that I'm going to be talking about a lot of different factors you need to consider. I'm not going to be giving you very specific things about policy. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. But I do want to give you a kind of a way of thinking about immigration from a kind of moral perspective. And I want to start by saying that, we might want to start by doing a kind of thought experiment, or just thinking about something this way. What if we had a people that lived in a certain territory, and they have a certain way of life, and a certain administration of law and justice, and then other people show up, and they want to live in that territory too, okay? What should the people who live in the territory think about when evaluating whether to let these new people in? I'm going to throw out 7 different factors, things they might want to think about or consider. First thing they should ask is, what do they have in their present community as it is that is good? What do they like about their current community? And there are lots of different elements to that. It might include economic well-being. It might include a certain amount of knowledge, skills, entertainment, various things of that sort. It might include a certain kind of relationship with each other, a certain kind of civic friendship. It might include some notion of how it is that human beings relate to the transcendent. Lots of different aspects that people might consider, good things about their current way of life, the way they live as a people. So that, so what's good in the current community? That would be the first thing you might think about. Second, you might ask, what are the ways that admitting new people may benefit our community? Something to consider. Third, you might ask, why do the newcomers want to be admitted? Fourth, you might ask, what are the ways that admitting the newcomers might be detrimental to the community? Are there harms that might arise from it? Fifth, what would be the effects on other people, let's say the country where they came from, or other countries, the effects of our admitting them into our country? We might want to ask, how will they mesh or fit into our society? And this means not only do they kind of fit in terms of obeying the law, that would be one level. More importantly, though, think of it almost in terms of marriage. You're living together, right? You've got a bunch of people living together, and we're going to admit this whole new group of people into this community where we live together. What kind of impact might that have? And then finally, the seventh factor would be, if we put ourselves in their place with their reasons to enter, what would we think about their not letting us in? Just kind of put ourselves in their shoes somehow or other. Okay? So those are a bunch of things to think about. Other factors might be thinking about bad reasons for admitting them. let's admit them so that we can exploit them, would be maybe a bad reason for doing it, right? Or something of that sort. Now, as we're thinking about this question, don't just think about the United States. We're trying to ask about broad moral questions, moral principles, governing whether one group of people should permit a bunch of new people to come into that society. So what might that apply to? How would this have applied to the Indians, considering whether they should let us into the United States? Or think about us today. Should we let people come from Mexico and Central America or from Asia? What about Europeans thinking of Muslims coming in large numbers into Europe? What about Africans thinking about Europeans coming into Africa, or people from South Asia coming into Africa? There's actually interesting conflicts in East Africa with respect to people from Asia. Consider Palestinians considering Jews coming into their territory, or Jews considering Palestinians coming into their territory. That is, we're looking for principles that transcend just one narrow set of circumstances. And keep in mind, of course, that there might be some very significant differences among the different situations that I just described. For instance, one factor might be you might have a very different set of considerations at a time when there's just a lot more open land, just readily available land, compared to a time when there's much less readily available land in this country that you have or live in. So these are some of the things you might want to think about as you try to construct some set of principles for dealing with immigration, provide a moral framework for dealing with immigration. Asking, what should people do when newcomers want to enter in? Now, the core of my talk tonight is that I want to say that a lot of useful ideas can come from using property rights as an analogy for immigration. That is, when you have people living in a country, in some sense you might say that territory is theirs. It's their property. And now we're asking, should they share it with newcomers who are coming into this territory? And there, as it turns out, this is what I thought was so interesting about the conference I attended. It doesn't tell you everything, and it's not a perfect fit. No analogy is. Analogies are analogies. But actually, the property rights analogy does take you pretty far. And that's what I want to talk about, okay? So the core, the central part of my talk is going to be divided into two parts. First of all, talking about principles of property rights, and then talking about applying that to the question of immigration, okay? I hope this is useful to you beyond the question of immigration, because after all, property rights are really interesting questions as well. And I think there's a lot of interesting things to be said about that. So I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to start off with, what are the moral principles regulating or regarding property? Okay, this is from a kind of natural law perspective. Okay, the first principle is this. Men, human beings, have certain ends inscribed in them. That is, we are creatures that have certain kinds of goods that make us flourish, other things that undermine that. We all have, certain kinds of human ends. And there are lots of ways of pursuing these ends. I mean, some of the ends, knowledge, life, integrity, family, living together in society. There are all these different elements that seem to be constituent elements of human nature. And if you want to flourish, if human beings want to flourish, they have to have some way of trying to achieve these goals, these various goals. Different people will do it in different ways, different forms, but all of us share some of these things. Now, we all want to pursue these human goods, but in order to pursue human goods, we need resources. As if we don't have anything at all, it's going to be very difficult to pursue those goods. If you want knowledge, I mean, you've got to be able to pursue the knowledge. But if you have no time, because all you're doing is working to keep alive, you're probably not going to be able to pursue knowledge too much, right? So you need resources. If you get those resources, that will help you be able to pursue them. So we start out with that basic principle that all of us human beings have certain kind of human goods to pursue, and we need resources to pursue those goods. Okay? That's the first principle for property rights. Second principle, what's called the universal destination of the world's goods or resources. There's all these resources in the world, and there are all these human beings in the world, and the resources are intended to make it possible for those human beings to live a good life. That is, to pursue, a good life as human beings. Okay? So in some sense, you might say all the goods of the world are there in order to make it possible for all the human beings in the world to live a good life. It's called the universal destination of human goods. Okay? So, for example, this would suggest that the policy of finders keepers won't cut it. Just because you got there first before other people doesn't mean you have a right to it over other people. Every human being, in some sense, has a right to the resources necessary to live a good human life. Okay? So that's the second principle. Third principle, to achieve the common use of the resources of the world, that's what I described in the second principle, that is that all the human beings get to have a share of the resources. So we're looking for a kind of common use of all these resources by everybody in the world. To achieve the common use, the availability of resources to everyone, of the world's resources, the best way to achieve that is private property. Now, this may sound counterintuitive to people. Somebody might say, well, no, isn't the best way, if the goods of the world are supposed to help everybody, then everybody in the world should own all the goods. Just kind of this massive kind of world society owns all the goods. But in fact, the natural law theory argues that private property is the best, the most effective way of getting resources to everybody in the world. Why? For one thing, it tends to increase resources. We tend to, when people own property privately, they take care of that property better, and they tend to use that property more effectively to make more property. If property belongs to everyone, then it doesn't belong to anyone. That's the problem. This is what the Puritans experienced when they first came over. The first winter, they held all their property in common, and half of them died. And it looked like this is the way it was going to continue. So after that first year, they actually divided the property up into private lots so that people would be able to work on those lots. And it's just a very deeply ingrained element of human nature that self-interest has a tremendous impact on what we do, and especially how hard we work and how well we take care of the property. Let me tell you, if all of you guys own a bit of property, what are the chances that property is going to get taken care of really well? Probably not too good. Because everybody's thinking somebody else will take care of it. If you own that property, you have an incentive, to invest effort into taking care of it and using it. Okay? So this is kind of the classic argument for private property. Actually, to elaborate a little bit further, actually, you might say, I think there are 3 subsets of reasons why private property is so valuable and so important. One is rooted in just human weakness. The fact that, theoretically, we should take good care of property, whether it's just ours or whether it belongs to everybody. But the fact of the matter is, we take care of it when it's our own. And that's a kind of human limitation, but it's a very deep part of human nature. So that's one set of reasons. Another set of reasons is rooted in what are maybe not so much human weaknesses as what you might call human limitations. Once we get beyond a very simple economic situation, human intellects are not capable of doing all the coordination that needs to be done to have a productive society. That is, just think of the basic price mechanism. In America, how do we know whether to produce more of something or to produce less of something? Is it because there's somebody, maybe at the Fed or somewhere else, who studies these things and says, what we need is X million dollars of steel or X pounds of lard? I don't know, whatever. Is there somebody kind of up there thinking, okay, that's what we have to figure out? Think about it. A nation of over 300 million people, and different people want different amounts of different things. How do you know, what needs to be done? Because keep in mind that economies are dynamic. People start wanting more of something and less of another thing. How is some bureaucrat, going to know the right answer to that? This was the problem of the Soviet Union. That's when you have central planning. You need bureaucrats who have this incredible level of knowledge that basically they're not capable of having. So what do we use? We use the price mechanism, right? That is, we use the law of supply and demand. That is, when people want more of something, the supply is constant, demand goes up, the natural result is that the price is also going to change as well. If the demand increases, that means you got more competition among the buyers, and so the price is going to go up. On the other hand, if you have a declining demand for something, then chances are that the price is going to go down, and then the supply will adjust to that price. Higher price, more supply; lower price, lower supply. It's just basic, the most basic, simple fact about economics, right? And so the point is simply that the coordination necessarily in a highly complex modern economy is not really possible to achieve by some kind of mechanism of central planning, okay? And the result is private property operating within certain kinds of economic forces, especially things like the law of supply and demand and the price mechanism, are much more effective at providing the coordination that's necessary for using property well. For getting the kinds of property we need, more of that, and less of the kinds of property we don't any longer need as much as we once did. And then finally, there's a third factor about private property as well. People and groups of people, such as families, inevitably occupy a certain amount of space. They get involved with certain particular objects in the world. And the result is that every person and group develops singular and more or less lasting ties to particular parts of the natural environment. You know, that is, it matters, you know, where we are and where we have formed attachments that influences us. I mean, it creates attachments that are very important to our nature. And the result is that we should acknowledge or somehow give some kind of account to those kinds of attachments. And that's part of why we have private property. That is, you know, we buy that house, you know, and you know, we raise our family in that house. You know, that house, that little bit of property is our own because it's something that's deeply part of our history as individuals, okay? And that too provides a kind of argument for private property, you know, rather than, you know, would you just kind of arbitrarily distribute people around anywhere, you know, that some central planner thought would be good to do, you know? Probably not. Okay, so these are 3 principles. The 4th principle for governing property: private ownership is not an absolute right. It can be limited in light of the overarching principle of the universal destination of human goods. Okay? That is, taking these first 3 categories together. The 3rd principle was private property rights exist, they're important, but you got to see them in light of the first 2 principles. And the kind of standard example is, you got a person who's got more money, literally, than they know what they can do with. There are people who are like this. Not you and me, probably, right? You know, but there are some people who literally could not spend all the money they have. You know, they just, it would be too much work figuring out how to spend it all, right? So that is, all of us try to have the certain necessities of life. We may go beyond that to have something that makes life go better, more comfortable. But beyond a certain point, people have what you might call superfluous goods. Now, superfluous doesn't mean they're bad, but just that you could hardly argue that they're really necessary for this person to have a good life. Okay? So you got some people who have superfluous goods, and you got other people who don't even have the necessities. You know? In a situation like that, the argument would be the universal destination of human goods requires that people who have private property should share some of their superfluous goods with other people. Okay? This is what's sometimes called the principle of stewardship. It doesn't mean there's not private property, but it means that private property should be understood in a certain way. Some people talk about it as the social mortgage on private property. Okay? And that's a very important principle. And now you shouldn't leap to the conclusion that that means they just have to give away all their property to the poor. That would be one thing to do. There are actually a whole series of things you might do in order to act responsibly with what you might call your superfluous goods. The fact that in some sense you owe that, you know, to share it with other people. What are some of the ways you might do that? One is you might put it into the pursuit of a kind of vocation or a skill that is beneficial to people. You know, if I had $1 million, or actually this is a concrete question I actually faced, you know, well, I wish I faced, about 5 or 10 years ago. You know, at one point I wanted to start a new university. Now, if I had ever won the lottery and gotten some massive Powerball payoff, you know, so, you know, maybe I got my $10 million or $15 million or whatever, I probably would have used that to start a new university, okay? I'm not giving it to the poor, but in some sense I am dedicating it to something that has social benefits, that would benefit a lot of other people. At least I hope it would. If I start a university, it would benefit other people. That's the point of it, right? So, so some people, for example, use some of that superfluous wealth to build up capital to start a new business. And again, that's valuable because it might provide jobs for other people, things like that. Might use it on the education of your children. Strictly necessary, maybe not strictly necessary, but certainly a beneficial use, not only for the kids, but also for society as well, because it benefits them to have well-educated people. It could be, philanthropy, setting up a foundation to give money to worthy causes. Might be the advancement of knowledge. People give to universities, or the advancement of arts. People give to the symphony or theater. Or you could just give it to the poor. There are lots of different ways in which these superfluous goods could be used. And also they can be distributed in various ways. Sometimes it's distributed through voluntary giving. That is, we leave it to the people themselves to decide how to take these superfluous goods and share them with others. It might be, as I said earlier, setting up a business so that it benefits others indirectly that way by providing more jobs and opportunities. Or sometimes it's through the mechanisms of the political community. Taxation. The government will take some of your superfluous goods in order to use them for helping other people who have needs in the community. Okay, that's my handy-dandy summary of principles of natural law regarding property. Now, how might that apply to immigration? As we're back to the situation now where it kind of looks like the people own their territory, and the question is, do they let these newcomers come into the territory that they own? Well, all the territory, not just the resources, but just even the physical territory of the world, is meant to support all human beings. And this territory is best used when it's divided up among different human beings and social groups who actually own parts of it. So we're kind of better off in the world when we're not having the whole world own the whole world. It's good actually to have nations, where different people have different territories throughout the world. So you again have the property, but then the social responsibility. Now, the ownership of property in land, like the ownership of other property, also carries with it similar obligations. What's superfluous, from over and above your necessities or some kind of decent kind of way of life, you have other superfluous goods that you should share with others. So what are the implications of that for your territory, actually sharing that with other people? Well, I want to give two principles, one of which is kind of immediate and then one of which is more general. The immediate principle might be, what about in emergencies? That is when some people have very harsh circumstances that constitute an emergency. With other property, one way to think about this is humanitarian aid. There's a flood on the other side of the world. Should we give some of our superfluous goods to people who are caught in these massive floods in Bangladesh, or if there's Ebola in Africa, or whatever? Well, these are very harsh, intense, short-term emergencies. And in some sense, there's a certain priority there. There's a special kind of responsibility to help people or peoples facing these very intense emergency situations. So, for example, with respect to territory, not only would we give money to people who are facing difficult situations on the other side of the globe, we also might admit some of those people into our country. This is the rationale for asylum, for example. We have other people who are suffering under very harsh circumstances, and so we feel there's a special obligation to help these people. Okay? So that would be one form in which we might satisfy the social obligations of property rights in the context of territory. Inviting some people to be part of our nation because they face these very harsh emergency circumstances. But let's go on to the second one, which is not so much the short-term emergency as more general principles regarding property. And I'd say, again, as a general principle, that wealthy nations ought to assist other poorer nations. And that's a good, solid moral principle, that we shouldn't, that especially wealthy nations can't simply say, I just don't care about what's going on with the other nations. It's as wealthy individuals need to share their superfluous goods with other individuals, so wealthy nations, in some sense, should share their superfluous goods with other nations. But this can be done actually in a lot of different ways. So for example, one thing we could do is we could help other poorer nations to develop, that is to help them be able to themselves achieve a higher level of resources that's more adequate for their people. It might be in the form of technical assistance. It might be capital to provide different kinds of businesses, whether micro or macro. So that's one way we can help other poor nations. A second way would be to permit people from a poor country to work in the United States. Sometimes guest worker programs would be an example of this, where there might be somebody in a different country who doesn't necessarily want to leave that country, but they have very great financial needs, so they might want to come to another country for a while to work there in order to be able to send back resources to their families. That's another way things might be done. Or another way might be actually letting poor people from those poor countries immigrate into your country, your wealthy country. That might be one way of satisfying the moral demand of sharing our wealth, our superfluous wealth, with other people. And having said this, there's another factor that would have to be taken into consideration, and that is considerations of equity among lots of different wealthy nations. Does one nation have the obligation to help all the poor people? Even, for example, the wealthiest nation, would it have the obligation to help all the poor people? Well, in addition to the fact it probably couldn't do that, because there are limits to what they can do, even with superfluous goods. That at least they can get, at the least you could say is that there are actually a lot of fairly wealthy nations. There's a lot of people in the world who have goods that aren't, that are well over and above what's strictly necessary. And so there are equity considerations that all nations ought to be thinking about, what they should do in order to support poorer nations. And so that, how exactly you work that out can be pretty tough, because what if you have other nations who are relatively wealthy and just stonewall on their responsibility? Does that mean that therefore, well, now the nation that's willing to do it has to do everything? Well, considerations of equity suggest that might not be fair and might not be necessary. How much? As I said, I'm not giving you answers. I'm giving you things to think about, factors to consider. Now, what's the main limit of the property rights analogy? Property rights especially concern goods, things that can be given or taken or whatever. It's harder to apply it to what you might call a way of life, sharing life in a community. I'm not sure how well this example works, but what if you go to your door someday, let's say you're pretty well off. You live in a very nice house in a nice neighborhood, and you go to the door, somebody rings a bell, you go to the door, and you open the door, and a husband and wife and 3 kids walk by you, and they drop their luggage in the living room, and they say, we're here because we're homeless, it's no fault of our own, you've got this big, beautiful house, and so you have to share it with us. And so they just camp out in your living room and that's going to be their part of the house from now on. Well, there might be lots of questions about that. But one of the major questions would be, the house is not just a physical place. It's a place where your family lives as a community. And having somebody just kind of barge in and live in your space is questionable. You know, I think you'd question it, right? I would question it if somebody showed up at my door and did that. You know, and it's partly because there's this whole dimension of the community as a shared way of life. We don't think about that much in the United States because modern nations tend to think of the political community in highly individualistic ways. As the typical American tends to think of the political community as something that provides a framework for him and maybe his family to get ahead, you know, to achieve my goals, you know, what I want to achieve. We don't, in the modern world, naturally think of ourselves as part of a community where there are shared goals of the whole community, where in some sense we share a way of life. I think we actually do that in many ways, but we don't think about it very much. And that, I think, complicates the question of immigration, as I'll suggest. Let me, so what I've done so far is given a kind of thought experiment to kind of get you thinking about certain kinds of questions, given some general rules of property, and say that that's not a bad analogy in some ways for principles of immigration. I want to say a little bit more now about immigration policy itself, and I'm not going to do this in detail, but I just want to elaborate a few things, a couple of principles. The first thing is that, as I kind of argued earlier, wealthy nations should recognize their obligation to admit, either temporarily or permanently, people from poorer nations that cannot sustain their population. But there are problems with this, because about the way you might go about it. What if the wealthy nation said, we're going to help out this poorer nation by admitting all their really well-educated and technically efficient people? Are we helping the poor country by kind of contributing to a kind of brain drain from that country? That's at least problematic. At least you'd worry about that. There's a kind of fairness norm you might ask about. We might ask ourselves, if we were the ones showing up and we were in need and we were not admitted, would we think that's unfair? You know, that is, again, it's always good to put yourself in the shoes of the other person, and you might or you might not, but it's a factor you have to at least consider. On the other hand, okay, so I've said, first of all, that wealthy nations have an obligation to share their blessings, their superfluous goods, with other nations. It can be done in various ways, but you know, one of them would be by admitting people from those poor nations into this country. A very important principle, though, that you'd have to add is that when you do this, you would want to do it in a way that doesn't have a negative effect on the common good of the receiving country. That is, the common good of the country, that's the goal. I mean, that's what a country exists to do, to pursue the common good. If admitting people from poorer countries would have a definite negative effect on the common good, that would be something to worry about. Normally, you don't want that. Normally, you want to be able to perform your moral obligation of sharing in a way that's consistent with the common good. But what does that entail? What are the factors relating to the common good? And I'm just going to, without any discussion of them, just kind of run through a whole list of different things. How are people admitted? You know, part of the common good would be admitting them in an orderly legal process, also with a due concern for national security, also in a manner permitting the appropriate assimilation of the immigrants. There's the number of people admitted. You know, we should try to admit people for whom we can actually provide jobs. We should, at the same time, try to minimize disruption of the domestic labor market. That is the harm done to wages of the people already in the country if you bring in a lot of new people. Which people are admitted? And certainly we want to bring in people who are willing to abide by our laws, not criminals, for example. We want to bring in people who are willing to take their fair share of citizen responsibilities, pay taxes, military service. You might want to consider, members of nuclear families as having a high priority, because that adds to family stability, which is an essential component of the common good, or could be. And then there's the really dicey question, and this is where things get sensitive, some of the issues we'll talk about this week. What about the relation of potential immigrants to the general culture? If the common good requires a certain kind of sharing of a way of life, at least in some respects, does there have to be a kind of minimum cultural homogeneity in order to have a country that works well, where the common good is successfully achieved? Could there be a situation where people are so different that having a community, a shared way of life, would be difficult? And this is where you get into a lot of the really complicated and difficult questions about immigration. If you do think that there needs to be some kind of sharing among the citizens of a community, a sharing of a way of life, not just a sharing of a process where we all pursue our own individual goods separately. Because if you actually had a community that only shared the fact that everybody could kind of get ahead for himself, it's not clear such a community could actually last. For one thing, communities sometimes require high levels of self-sacrifice. They require people who are willing to die for the community, in wars especially, So does a community actually have a sufficient civic friendship, a sufficient sense of the ties among them, that they have this kind of minimum cultural homogeneity, this common sharing in a way of life that makes it possible to have an effective society? So, for example, to take the really controversial questions and just throw them out there, do differences in religion have an impact on whether or not a common good can really be achieved? Think India at independence, right? Ultimately, they had to split into Hindu and Muslim nations. So now we've generally been able to avoid that, although we talked about the nativism. A lot of people, when they viewed Americans coming to our country, American Catholics, the Irish, a lot of them were deeply convinced that Catholics failed that principle of whether we had sufficient cultural homogeneity. Because Catholics were really subjects of this foreign potentate called the Pope, And while I think that was wrong, it's not the slam dunk question you might think it is. there are actually some theoretical reasons why it's not surprising that some people had questions about Catholicism and whether a Protestant nation could really absorb a large number of Catholics. So I mean, all I'm saying is religion an issue that's sometimes legitimate to consider? And I'd say, well, at least we've got to think about it. Is race an issue to be considered? You know, you can't say this in public in the United States because the assumption is the happy talk that, of course, everybody of every race can get along just fine. And of course, in principle, that's true and should be the case. Look around the world. You know, look at the nations divided by race. So are there ever situations where it would be legitimate to exclude people from a country because of their race? In 1994, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed in Rwanda. 70% of the Tutsi population was murdered, executed in a very short period of time. If you were Rwanda or Burundi, the nearby country, would you say, maybe we ought to think twice about how many Hutus and Tutsis we admit into our country? I don't know what the bottom line answer is, but if you tell me it's stupid or immoral to ask the question, I think that's just a kind of blindness. It's happy talk, you know, ignoring the fact that we have to confront the fact that human beings of different races don't always get along very well. I think the United States actually is extremely blessed in this respect. We've had the blot, of course, of slavery and the subsequent racial injustice even after slavery was ended. But by historical standards, I mean, America is a remarkably multiracial society. You know, and I would argue that because of the principles of our nation, we shouldn't use race as a principle in considering immigration. But I wouldn't say that's a universal principle for every country. I can imagine situations where it would be perfectly reasonable to consider that, even if I don't think it's the case in our country. Culture, what a broad term, right? There's just, it encompasses so much. Can we admit people from all different kinds of cultures without any attention to the question of whether those cultures are supportive of what we value in our culture? I can phrase the question this way. There's a lot of happy talk about diversity in this country. There should be. Diversity is a wonderful, valuable thing. Why? Why is diversity good? Not just because of difference. I mean, the simple fact of difference by itself isn't automatically good. Some differences are really good. Some differences are kind of bad, right? You know, presumably, when we talk about diversity, we talk about people coming to the United States from a different culture and bringing with them much in their culture that is good, you know? And you can actually go through the ways of immigration in our society. I think there's a lot to be said for saying that WASP culture benefited from an infusion of non-WASP, Southern European Catholic culture. You know, there were certain real benefits to that. On the other hand, if cultural factors can be good, couldn't they, in principle, sometimes be bad? You know, how so? Well, one thing we really value in our culture is the rule of law. We think that's very important. You know, generally, we act according to law. We kind of treat people equally, you know. There are whole cultures in which the rule of law makes no sense at all. People would actually deny that the rule of law is a good principle. Cultures based on kinship generally are based on the principle that I help my family and my friends and not my enemies. And that's why what we call corruption in many other cultures doesn't look like corruption. I was just helping my family. Well, I mean, Is that corruption? Well, we think it's corruption with our rule of law. In many other parts of the world, that's not corruption. That's doing your duty to your other members of the family. If we admit a lot of people from that kind of culture into our society, that's potentially a problem, right? Now, again, where do you draw the bottom line? I'm not telling you anything about that in this talk. You know, I'm just saying these are things we have to think about. And I'm especially concerned that we not just stick our heads in the sand and ignore important questions just because we feel uncomfortable talking about race and culture and religion and so forth. You know, we have to kind of honestly, straightforwardly confront the issue. So let me end there.